You probably already know that if I drag this down, the object will become more reflective, and then if I drag this up, it'll be less reflective. Pretty much no object has like no reflections, but you know, some very rough object is going to have a higher value here. So the reason that I bring this up is that Rgb values, so like this slider here, is actually the same as this slider here. So if I plug this into there and adjust this, these are the same values as these, as long as I haven't messed with the saturation. You don't want to plug in values, or you don't want to plug in anything with like color data with actual saturation in a roughness, because that's kind of a mismatch. You would have a yellow here and then a gray here. If this is completely desaturated, then it can serve as a gray output. Hopefully that makes sense. Now going further with this, if I plug a noise texture into there, actually I'm going to preview this by Control-Shift clicking on this. You should enable the Node Wrangler add-on in case you haven't. So this one right here. So you can see as I scale this up, you can see how like parts of it are darker and parts of it are lighter. The entire thing corresponds to an Rgb value. It's just different parts of it have different Rgb values. And you can see it's also grayscale, which is helpful. It's more universal. It can be plugged into pretty much, well, it can't be plugged into the normal directly, but it can be used as a normal, which we'll get into later. But you know, you can plug it into the color. You can use it for displacement. So the reason that if you go into texture, where's texture here, and then just select any of these, they always have a factor which is like a grayscale. It's because it's more compatible with the overall system. So yeah, these darker values are closer to 0, and then the lighter values are closer to 1. So if I plug it into the roughness and then plug this in there, now the areas that are darker in the noise texture are more reflective, and then the areas that are lighter are less reflective because they have a higher value in this. So now I'm going to change the view here to something like 30,000. Like if you see that your camera is like clipping, or you don't see the end of the plane, then it's because this is too low. So there are a lot of textures here. Like I for example just brought in a wave texture. It looks like this, and you know, the same principle applies here with the darker values being like closer to 0, and then the lighter values being closer to 1. And in case you're wondering like what a texture like looks like, you can always just visualize it by Control-Shift clicking on it. And another one that's commonly used, actually wave texture I don't use that often. The ones that are most often used, I would say, are Voronoi, Musgrave, and Noise. These other ones do have their uses, but again, you can visualize them yourself. Yeah, so Musgrave looks like this. It's kind of more, it's similar to Noise, but it's more contrasty. It has a little bit more waves, like on the edges of the white parts, or yeah, on the edges in general. And then, yeah, so, and then Voronoi is a bit interesting. You might be thinking that, well, this is fairly similar to Noise. We can actually do some pretty interesting things with this. For example, if I drag this contrast up, and then if I change this to F2, Chebyshev, actually not F2, F1, and then crank up the scale, now we have this look, which is like a grid. So then creating the actual water shader isn't that difficult. We can just bring in a noise and then a bump. So this will kind of convert the format, because this alone will cause problems. So if you plug it into the height and then plug this normal output into the normal input there, it'll kind of do what it's supposed to do. If you visualize the bump, it actually looks really weird if I crank up the scale. Yeah, so you can see that this is kind of what it looks like. This should not be used for anything other than normal, basically. This right now isn't quite what I want. I'm actually gonna click on this texture here and then press Control T, and that'll bring this up. And then I found object to give good results. If you're wondering what these are, generated, object, and UV are the only ones that I use. I mean, you can use some other ones. This is basically how the texture should be outputted, I guess. So there are a variety of different ways. So like, I believe it defaults to generated, but this might not always give good results, because if your object is like stretched, then it's going to kind of like stretch out the texture as well. So I find object worked pretty well when I was doing this. If object isn't giving you the results that you want, then you might want to change it to UV and then apply the scale, and then edit mode, select the object, and then smart UV project, and then it might give you better results then. I'm going to crank this down because that was just for visualizing. So we're actually going to be using this setup a lot. So in order to do that without having to duplicate it multiple times, we can select all of them and then right click and then group. So you actually entered a different menu now. If you select the group output here on the right and then press tab, you'll go back to where you were before. But you see that this has changed to something called a node group. And I'm actually going to change this name here to noise. And this includes the nodes that we selected to create a quote-unquote group with. So if we select this and then press tab, now we're back in this group. It not only helps with like compressing the graph, but it also can help with like if we duplicate this and then we change these values, like if I take this input and then plug it into this group input here and then press tab, and then I can change this. But if I duplicate this and then change this, it's actually not going to affect this one. So in case you are still wondering, this factor output is kind of coming out of here. So you can think of this as like this is going through here, and then this is like what's coming out of this is like coming through here. I'm trying to think of the right way to word this, but the reason you have this group output is so that you can decide, okay, this group ends here, and then as soon as you hit this point, this is then kind of outputted. The output of this is like here. So, and then this node doesn't do anything other than to separate the group from the rest of the graph. And I should also mention that you can have multiple outputs. So like if I take this color and then put that into there, then this will also show up here. And if you want to adjust things, like maybe you plug something in and then you unplugged it and then you don't actually want this, like in my case, you can select the group output and then press N to bring up this menu, and then I think it's in group here, and then you see the outputs and then the inputs. So because I plugged this into here, this is now considered an input. So in my case, I want to get rid of one of the outputs. So this factor here is this here, and then this color here is this here, so I can remove that color. And then to clarify what the input does, it overrides the value of this, I guess. So maybe overrides isn't quite the right term, but if I change this, it's changing this value here. And that's of course because this is what this is plugged into, and you can have multiple inputs as well. So like I'm actually going to take the roughness, detail, distortion, plug it into there, and now the same thing applies here. Changing this will change the respective values that you're there plugged into from here. Setting this to 4D will allow you to adjust this W, which is a seed, so like it'll change what the noise looks like without changing any of these. And then I'm going to plug that in there, and then press N, and then select this W here, and then move it up by hitting this arrow a bunch of times. I'm also going to add in a brightness contrast node and plug those in there. So we can set the base color here to black and the roughness to 0. And now it kind of is starting to look like water. My scale, I might want to adjust my scale. Be sure to apply the scale on your plane. 0.3, let's see how that looks. Yeah, 0.3 looks kind of decent, and that's a good start, I think. So I want to blend this with another noise, so that we have low frequency detail and high frequency detail. So I'm going to duplicate this and then plug that in there, and then use another noise for the actual blending. And then this is of course going to be some random seed. It's common to use a color ramp for stuff like this. It's similar to how contrast behaves, but you know, you could say you have a little bit more control, or like it's specifically targeting the black values and white values. Now's a good time to start on lighting. I'll link the HDRI that I use in the description. Okay, this is looking weird. When I was doing this before, I didn't use this, so it's Control X to get rid of that. I just used 1.5 here and 0.2 here for the factor for the blending, and then a 0.2 here, and then 0.4 here. And that looks all right.